Hey there guys, and welcome to this new video on creating a custom React data table. And in this video I'm going to show you guys how to arrange your data table and how to implement the scroll functionality. So I'm basically going to show you guys how to leave from such a plain looking data table to something that resembles more of this. So you can see there's this scroll bar in this new data table such that when you have more columns than the table can display, you can actually scroll over to see all your columns on your data table. So without wasting more time, I'm going to head over to the code, and here side by side we see that we have the two different codes. Here is for the modified data table, that's for this data table, and this over here is for the previous data table, that's the data table that we had in the last video, this data table over here. So the first thing we can take note as difference between the two tables is in our newly created data table over here, we can see that we have a distinguished table header component, or this new row, or should I call it header component, which contains all our actions and all our icons. And we have a distinct footer as well, which contains all the footer elements. Unlike this table over here where we see there's kind of a distinction because we have this row which contains the search bar and the sort icon, but it's completely merged to our table header. And yeah, I think this is not, well, it's less presentable than having this over here where we have a completely different column for, or should I say row for all our icons being displayed over here. So not only does this look more organized visually, but if we check in our code too, we see that here is the code for our newly created data table, or well, the newly improved data table with the scroll functionality, and it looks a lot more organized than this over here. Because when we compare the two codes, the first thing we can take note of is in these two codes, here is our table element. So for this newly created data table, that's this data table, we can see that it's a lot more organized because here's our table element, and in this table element we have just the table head and the table body. So we have no other icons displaying in between TDs, or no elements displaying in between TDs, like in the case over here where we have the table head, and we have all this jargon over here where we have a lot of TDs with some displaying nothing even, and yeah, we're trying to display search bar and sort icons and other stuff inside these TDs. So this approach works, but it's not the best because not only is it not, well, visually appealing as code, it also gives us a lot of restrictions on how well we can organize our items and stuff like that. Because displaying items, for us to display items inside TDs, we saw that we need to have a lot of these empty TDs just there to fill space and all of that. Same as the table footer, you see we're putting all of this inside TRs. So we're putting a lot of items inside table rows and inside TDs and leaving some empties, and yeah, that doesn't, well, it just looks so much dirty compared to what we have over here where everything is clean. So what we're doing over here in this new improved code is all of these jars, that's, we have a different section for our table header. As we can see, we have this class name, and what we're doing is in this section we're calling this function which is going to render us all those header components or all those icons. Because if I go ahead and open this function, that's the create table header components row. If I go ahead and open this, you see we just have this div where we're displaying all of this, and what this div is, what this styling or this class name of header div is going to do is it's going to help us later on to be able to style this div. Because if we check in our CSS, what we are doing is we have all these components and we are later on applying a display of flex on this div and justification of end to be able to position them in a flex box and send all of them to your right end. So yeah, that's basically it. If we come over here to our CSS, you see the CSS2 is modified and we have actually some styles to handle a lot of that. And As I said, if we come to header div over here, we just have some normal styles with the display of flex, and we are justifying the content to the end, and just some borders, align items to the center, and giving some gap between all the items. So that's what we have for our header. And now same for our footer also, because we have this new section we need here for our footer. And the footer now is what contains all of these footer elements. So if I go ahead and open this new function, that's create table footer row over here. So we're also just returning a div with this class name, and in the div we have some spans. This is the first span, the second span, and the last span. And in these spans we are doing all of these, we are just the different components for pagination and all of that. So it's completely different from this case where all those components are being displayed inside TDs, and yeah, here now it looks a lot better and more organized. So if we go back to our table element and how the scroll functionality proper is being implemented, you can see over here in our table element we have just the table head and just the table body, but over here we actually wrapped our table component in two divs. The first, which is actually this section, is the outer wrapper, and the second div is the scroll wrapper. So the outer wrapper is just a box that contains, well, the actual table element, and the scroll wrapper is now, well, your whole scroll pane. So it's actually what moves, and it's on this that we are going to apply some styling to be able to um, apply this scroll functionality on the table. So the scroll functionality is practically handled in the CSS. So after wrapping your table element inside these two new divs, that's the scroll wrapper and the outer wrapper, all you have to do is to come and give a couple of styles in your CSS to both the table and the scroll wrapper, the outer wrapper as well. So if we look into our CSS, we now see that the table, well, I gave it a border of collapse to collapse all the borders, and I gave it this width of max content and a minimum width of 100%. So, well, you practically want to give this max content before the minimum width, because if you invert that, I think I tried that and it didn't work. Well, the scroll functionality was not as, yeah, was not as expected. So you give the width first of max content and a minimum width of 100% to the table. So for the scroll wrapper, what you want to do is you want to give it an overflow of scroll. So giving it an overflow X of scroll makes you to be able to scroll horizontally. Same as overflow of Y. If you give that overflow Y of scroll, you're going to be able to scroll vertically. But in this case, since as we already have our functionality to change the number of columns, yeah, implementing a vertical scroll was not really necessary. But feel free to implement a vertical scroll. So if, yeah, so we have that. And yeah, for our outer wrapper, it's just practically a box. So you wanna give the box some margin, a width, and again some margin of auto. So now that I'm looking at this, I'm seeing that it's pretty much well, giving margin twice. So you can feel free to go ahead and take away one of these. So I'm just going to go ahead and comment this one. And if we check back in our code, so that actually changes nothing. So yeah. And yeah, so for our outer wrapper, we just give it a width and some margin of auto. Then for our header section, this is actually for the whole section that encompasses our header component. Because if you come back, to our data table, we have this header section over here, and it's actually what encloses this div, or encompasses this div with all our icons and all our functionality buttons. So what we want to do with that div is we're just giving it some background color, giving it some height, width, and all of that jazz. So yeah, I'm not going to go deeper to explain the code. So We're just going to end at this point, but all the code is found on the link to our GitHub repository. So feel free to hit up that code and download and yeah, explore more for yourself. So I think I'm going to talk about one last thing though, and that's actually for this hover functionality. So I'm going to move to still the CSS, and that functionality is implemented right over here. So what we're doing is we're selecting the body and all table row elements which are a direct child of the body. So what we want to do is for those table elements which are direct children of the body, when hovered on, so when you hover on a table row, we want to select all the thesis of that table row, and yeah, practically just give them this light blue background color and make the text in them to be white. So that gives us this feel. So when we hover, we have that light blue background color and some text of white. So yeah, guys, with that, I think that's how we're able to transition from this data table, which was less flexible and yeah, more scattered, less organized, to this new looking feel with new header and new footer and a scroll functionality implemented. So in the next video on data tables still, I'm going to show you guys how to implement hiding and showing of table columns, because actually this thing is a scroll, and I added a lot of columns repeating. If you see, we'll have name, matrical, and this was just to show how the scroll functionality is going to look like. But if I come over here to our code, and I'm going to actually reduce the number of rows we have displaying on this data table. So I'm just going to cut that down, then save, come back here and refresh. And now we have a data table of just, well, a fair quantity of rows which all fit. So now that everything fits, we see the scroll bar disappears. And if we click on this columns icon over here, we get this drop down with all our rows in them. So we can actually hide some rows. So if I go ahead and click here, we see that action bar disappears and we can't edit or delete the row anymore. So if I click back on that and back, we see the action row appears. Same for ID, name, matricle, age, and see now it permits us to actually hide all the rows on our data table as well as display back all the rows on our data table. And I'm going to show you guys how to implement that functionality in our next video. So the code is already on our GitHub repository. You can feel free to get the code, but if you want to understand more on how the code functions to be able to implement that in your own projects, always feel free to come back and check out our videos. And if it helps you, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channels for more videos which are going to be released on data tables. Thank you guys, and see you guys in the next video.